very similar with naturalistic observations. We get multiple observations noting what varies with actor and target and context. We try to take account of confounding variables, holding the actor constant and the actor and the target constant and varying the context, holding the context and the target constant and varying the actor. We perform something like a statistical analysis of variance. Now, you're not dividing the sums of squares and all of that kind of stuff the way you do in an analysis of variance, but you're doing something like that in your head. And then this calculus is getting you a logical conclusion, a conclusion that logically follows from the evidence given various kinds of the premises. So this covariation calculus is very rational in many ways. It's an algorithm. It's a recipe for performing an operation that, if applied properly, will inevitably give you the right answer. That's what an algorithm is, okay? Basically a formula. And that's fine. This is a rational way to do things, and Kelly proposed that when people in the ordinary course of everyday living go around the world trying to figure out why things happen, what they do is they apply something like the covariation calculus. This model, which Kelly announced in 1967, dominated studies of causal attribution for at least the next 15 years or so, but it came under challenge with some, as people continue to do various kinds of studies. Some of these are kind of conceptual challenges. There are problems with the use of algorithms in social judgments. An algorithm is the rational way to go because it's guaranteed to give you the right answer, but sometimes you just don't know what the algorithm is. Now, obviously, people do know something like the covariation calculus, or MacArthur's experiment wouldn't have worked out the way it did, but sometimes you just don't know what the algorithm is, and under those circumstances, you can't apply it. You can't apply an algorithm that you don't know. Or there may not be enough information available. Remember that the covariation calculus requires that you have multiple observations of behavior, so you can do something like hold the actor and the target constant and vary the context. What that means is you've got to observe John and Andy Kaufman in lots of different circumstances. Okay? If you don't have that information, you can't apply the covariation calculus. Or you might actually have the information available to you, but for one reason or another, you either can't use it or don't want to use it. Maybe because you don't have enough time to perform the whole calculus, right? Or maybe because you just don't care, enough to perform the whole calculus. Any of these conditions, the algorithm is unknown, there's not enough information, there's not enough time, there's not enough motivation. Any of these circumstances comprises a situation that's known in the judgment and decision-making literature as judgment under uncertainty. When you've got all the information, you've got the algorithm, you can be certain of the cause just by applying the algorithm. If there's any loss of information, then you're making judgments under conditions of uncertainty. And one criticism of proposals like the covariation calculus is that we hardly ever have all the information that you need to apply it. MacArthur, in her dissertation, was able to do this because she created these artificial situations and made sure that all the information was available. But if you're walking down the street and you see two kids fighting, okay, that's all you got, is those two kids fighting. You can't say, well, I'm going to wait to figure out whether I call the police or intervene or just kind of walk on until I observe them fighting and observe them in People's Park and observe them on the quad and observe them at Yali's and observe them in Starbucks. You can't always do that, right? And the one critique of the rational procedures like the covariation calculus is simply it's just unrealistic to think that people really do this kind of thing. I'd argue that people do this kind of thing whenever they can. Okay, and if you just kind of think about your own causal explanations for a second, you'll see that that's probably true. But it's a fair point. Okay, now it turns out, in addition to these problems with applying algorithms in general, kind of conceptual problems, as studies of the covariation calculus and other aspects of causal attribution went on, a whole bunch of phenomena emerged that led people to think that something else was going on entirely. In especially the case, there were three major departures that were observed from the covariation calculus when we studied how people actually make causal attributions. And these departures occur despite the fact that people have sufficient information to apply the calculus. Okay, it wouldn't be fair to say, well, people don't apply the calculus when you don't give them the opportunity to apply the calculus. Yeah, give them all the information that they need, and they still don't always apply it. So one, perhaps the most famous of these errors, is now known as the fundamental attribution error, so named by Lee Ross, a professor at Stanford. And he said, look, what happens in the fundamental attribution error, there are different ways of phrasing this, but generally, Ross argued that people overestimate the role of the actor, overestimate the importance of the actor, and underestimate the importance of the situation. Here, this says dispositions, by which we mean the actor's dispositions. So that's the fundamental attribution error. Then Ned Jones and Dick Nisbet pointed out that there's also a difference in the causal attributions that people make about their own behavior compared to the causal attributions that they make about other people's behavior. So, for example, we generally make dispositional attributions about other people. When you try to explain your roommate's behavior or to somebody you don't know very well, you'll usually say, well, he does that because he's an idiot, or he does this because he's very extroverted, or whatever. But when we make attributions about ourselves, Jones and Nisbet argued that we tend to make situational attributions. We attribute our own behavior to the context in which it occurs, not to our own dispositions. Hardly anybody says, I did this because I'm an idiot. Okay? They usually make a reference to the situation. And then finally, Albert Hasdorf, who was also at Stanford, pointed out that there's a kind of self-serving bias in causal attribution, especially about people's own behavior. People tend to take responsibility for behavior that has a positive outcome, and they tend to deny responsibility for behavior that has a negative outcome. They attribute negative outcomes to the situation. Question?
Do any of these persist strongly in unambiguous situations?
Yeah, that's the point. Okay, that even when people have all the information they need, okay, and I'll give you an example of that from MacArthur's own study in about 4 minutes, okay? Yes, that happens. These wouldn't be errors and biases if they did not occur when people could do otherwise, okay? So the idea here is that people have all the information they need. Here are some statements of the fundamental attribution error. You can actually find hints of this in Hyder's own work. This is Ross. The intuitive psychologist started with his general tendency to overestimate the importance of personal or dispositional factors relative to environmental influences. Here's a restatement by Dick Nisbet and Lee Ross later. But that's the general idea. People too readily infer broad personal dispositions, overlooking the impact of relevant environmental forces and constraints. Here's a nice example of this. This is one that Ross himself pointed to. This is a very famous study on attitudes or attitude attributions by Ned Jones and one of his students. And here, what you're trying to do is to infer from a person's behavior what his attitudes are. Okay, it's an old study. Notice 1967. People were asked to watch the debates and then to infer from the debaters' behavior what their own attitudes were. And there were actually reading essays for and against Fidel Castro, a big issue in 1967, or for and against racial segregation. In both of these cases, the so-called opposed side is normative, so that most people in America at that time weren't too happy about Fidel Castro, and most people in America at that time weren't too happy about racial segregation either. But what the subjects did was to read either pro or anti-Castro or pro or anti-segregation essays, and then rate the attitude towards Castro or segregation on the part of the person writing the essay. Now you say, well, okay, you just read the essay, right? If they say Castro's a wonderful person, they like Castro or not. The trick to this is that the subjects were told that in that for some essays, the essay writer had a choice as to which position he could take. For other essays, the position was assigned to him. If any of you have ever been on a debate team, for example, you know sometimes you just get assigned the con side, and you find yourself arguing in favor of things like racial segregation, because that's the way debates are done. So here, the essay writers had a choice. Here, they had no choice, and the information was given to the subjects, and then they were simply asked to infer what the attitudes of the essay writers were. So this is just for the Castro speech. The results here are very clear. When people had a choice, okay, people inferred that the writer of the pro-Castro speech liked Castro, and that the writer of the anti-Castro speech didn't like Castro. But even when the subjects knew that the essay writers had no choice about their position, they still made that inference. It wasn't quite as strong, but it's there, inferring that the pro-Castro writer was in favor of Castro and the anti-Castro writer was opposed to Castro. This, Lee Ross argued, was just irrational, right? What you should say is, I don't know what his attitude is. He was told what to rate. That would be the rational way to do it. But still, people showed a tendency to overestimate the importance of personal dispositions, like one's own attitudes, and underestimate the importance of the situation, like whether or not they had some kind of choice. A classic demonstration of the fundamental attribution error. Ross also looked at Leslie MacArthur's big study and found, again, some evidence for this fundamental attribution error. If you simply look at the proportion of attributions that are made to the actor or to the target or to the situation or to some combination, given that people had full information about consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness information, or no information at all, notice that regardless of the pattern of information, people like attributing the behavior to the actor. There's a bias towards attributing information to the actor. And that same bias held even when people had no information at all. All they said was, John laughed at the comedian, and when forced to choose, they said it was something about John. Notice as well that especially in the no information condition, people were very unlikely to make attributions to the situation. When all they knew was John laughed at the comedian, nobody said, oh, everybody was drinking at the time, or whatever. So again, the difference here is the kind of difference that gave rise to Ross's notion of the fundamental attribution error. Okay, that's basically how that works. Here's another example of this. This is also from MacArthur's dissertation. And what you can see here is that people really rely on consistency information to make these distinctions. If the consistency information is the overwhelming determinant of whether people made attributions to the situation or not. If consistency information was, especially if it was high, they tended not to make situational attributions. If it was low, they tended to make situational attributions. But still, overall, there's this pattern of error where people have a bias towards attributions to the actor. Okay, let's look at the other two here for a second. The actor-observer difference in causal attribution. Here's an early foreshadowing of it by Hyder. Here's the classic statement by Jones and Nisbet. In various books and articles that you might read, this is sometimes known as the self-other difference, actor-observer, self-other difference in causal attribution. It's the same. It's the same thing. Here's a nice statement of it from Ned Jones. When a student is doing poorly, discusses his problems with an advisor, there's often a fundamental difference of opinion between the two. The student is usually able to point to environmental obstacles. Okay, my roommate is too noisy, or whatever. The advisor is convinced instead that the failure is due to enduring qualities of the student. Okay, that's the actor-observer difference. The actor, the student, making an attribution to the situation. The observer making an attribution to the person, the student. David Watson, now at Notre Dame University, reviewed the entire literature on this back in the 80s and found that, in fact, there is some evidence for the actor-observer difference, but not nearly as much as you might expect. The big difference is when people make attributions to situations, they are much more likely to make attributions to the situation when they're explaining their own behavior than when they're explaining other people's behavior. That's the essence of the actor-observer difference. But the actor-observer difference also implies some other things, like attributions concerning the self ought to more involve situations and traits, and that doesn't turn out exactly to be true. Attributions concerning others ought to involve more traits and situations, and that doesn't turn out to be quite true either. Attributions to traits ought to be made more when we're talking about other people than ourselves, and that turns out not to be true. But this one does turn out to be true. The essence of the actor-observer difference, attributions to the situation, are much more likely to be made when we're explaining our own behavior than when we're explaining other people's behavior. And then finally, I have just enough time for this, the self-serving bias in causal attribution. Again, here is a foreshadowing of this by Hyder. Here's the classic statement of it by Hasdorf and his colleagues. This difference is also known as the ego bias, or the ego-defensive bias, or sometimes the ego-protective bias in causal attribution. Same name, the different name for the same phenomenon. We tend to take responsibility for good outcomes. We tend to deny responsibility for bad outcomes. We attribute good outcomes to our own personal qualities. We attribute bad outcomes to features of the situation. Here's another statement of it by Tony Greenwald. People perceive themselves as selectively more responsible for desired but not undesired outcomes. Again, there are a couple of predictions that you would derive from this. Here's a nice example from Greenwald, asking students to judge an examination's quality. Students who do well are willing to accept credit for their success. I did well in the exam because I'm smart. Those who do poorly, unwilling to accept responsibility for failure, instead seeing the exam or the instructor as being insensitive to their abilities. Everybody's had this experience, and it's this kind of anecdotal evidence that gave rise to the general acceptance of the self-serving bias. But it turns out, again, the evidence, the actual empirical evidence, is a little is a little weak. The self-serving bias comes in two forms. The self-protective bias, where failure is attributed to external rather than internal causes, and it turns out not to happen as often as you'd like. But the self-enhancing bias does occur. It's a very strong effect. In the literature that Miller and Ross reviewed, success tends to be attributed to internal rather than external causes. I did well in the exam because I'm smart. I did well in the exam because I studied hard. And those are internal kinds of causes. Okay, the covariation calculus as an expression of normative rationality, taking consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness information, putting it through essentially a computation that yields a causal attribution to the actor, to the target, to the context, or some combination of those things. That is a rational way for people to explain the events that occur in their lives. We know from studies like MacArthur's that people do apply the covariation calculus when they're given enough information to do so. But even when they're given enough information to do so, there still seem to be these systematic biases, maybe a little bit weaker than you might have thought, but still these systematic biases towards error, fundamental attribution error, tendency to attribute behavior to the actor's internal dispositions and ignore the situation, the self-other difference, and the ego-protective bias, the self-serving bias, magnifying these things a lot. Okay, that's where the situation stands right now. That's the situation as it's reflected in your textbook. The world is a little bit different from that, I think, and what I'm going to do next time is to do a deeper analysis of these errors and biases, and then offer a new framework, a different framework for making causal attributions, and look at the status of these errors and biases from the perspective of that framework. Have a good weekend. I'll see you Monday.